Good evening all, and welcome. I hope you're ready for a night of spooks as we venture into the world of the paranormal. I am also very fortunate to be joined by our collaborators today, Top 5 Darkest. Once you're done here, be sure to check out their channel. The link will be found on screen at the end and in the description. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When my daughter was about a year old, we moved into a 2-story townhouse, kitchen and living room downstairs, bedrooms upstairs. One day, when I was walking from the living room to the kitchen, I saw what looked like a large black cloud in the middle of the room that quickly disappeared into the ceiling. I brushed it off as my eyes adjusting to the light in the room and forgot about it. But shortly thereafter, I started noticing my daughter would sit in the middle of the kitchen and babble away like she was talking to someone. And almost every night, she would wake up at 2 a.m. and start chattering away. After watching something on TV, I decided that maybe it wasn't just a lot of random events, and maybe there was something there. One day, I stood in my bedroom, introduced myself, and said that if there was someone there who wanted to communicate with me, I would listen. The next day I woke up to a tapping in the room. It took a few minutes to find the source. The corner of a poster hanging on the wall was being pulled out a few inches and then let go, so that it would hit the wall. No AC on, no open windows. I laid there and watched for a few minutes, then decided I was too chicken to respond, and ran out of the room. A few nights later, I woke up with the feeling of someone being in the room with us. The room was pitch black, which is unusual since we had a nightlight in the bathroom in case we had to get up with the baby. I looked at my clock to see if the power had gone off, but it was still working. Once my eyes adjusted a little more, I could see a moving mass in the doorway, like a black cloud but moving. I put the covers over my head and pretended it wasn't there, but didn't wake up my husband, who didn't know anything about the other experiences either. Later that week, my daughter wakes up at 2 a.m, chatter time, but this time she is screaming. One night I fell asleep on the couch downstairs and woke up to my husband thundering down the stairs. He tells me he woke up feeling like something was watching him and saw a mass of black smoke in the doorway. He ran through it on his way out of the room and said it felt like electricity. A few minutes later, the baby started screaming. This continued for weeks. The screaming every night, feeling like someone was watching us, seeing black blurs out of the corner of our eyes. In November, I found out my grandmother was dying. The day that I received the call was the last sleepless night we had. It was almost like it took pity on us and left us alone. This isn't the only experience I've had, but they always seem to center around my daughter. She's 14 now, and I have encouraged her to retain her ability to talk to and see things that most people cannot.
1. First and foremost, let me be quite clear about something. Ghosts do not exist. People can argue that science doesn't know everything or whatever until they're blue in the face, but the fact remains that the existence of disembodied spectres would undermine several existing laws of physics. If ghosts could exist, then your computer wouldn't work. That's just the way the tapestry of the universe is woven together. With that said, however, there remains a moment in my life that I simply cannot explain. My brother and I had shared a bedroom for most of my childhood, but as I entered into adolescence, I decided that I wanted a little bit more privacy. In pursuit of that goal, my father suggested that I collaborate with him to turn an unfinished section of the house, which had previously been little more than a storage space, into a room of my own. It spawned a project that spanned almost the entirety of my summer vacation, with me doing the vast majority of the work but still following whatever advice was offered. Throughout it all, I kept my mind's eye focused on the finished product, which would ultimately be a brand new bedroom with a window that overlooked the nearby creek bed. Now, that aforementioned creek bed was something of a staple location for my childhood games, but it wasn't without an oddly mysterious nature. Near its mouth, there was a large metal pipe that extended beneath the road, and although my brother and I often used the passage as a route to the opposite side of the street, we were never entirely comfortable making the journey. Strange sounds would often emanate from within the depths, like the ethereal whispers of some departed spirit. On less common occasions, usually as the sun was setting, we'd even hear an ominous knocking echoing out of the shadows. We decided, of course, that the pipe was legitimately haunted. I even developed an entire backstory for the ghost that supposedly resided there. She was a 12-year-old girl who had drowned in a flash flood, and who needed to make out with a 12-year-old boy before she could pass on. Sometimes, as my brother and I lay awake in bed at night, we pretend that the flicker of light on the walls, the products of passing cars' headlights, were actually the struggles of her soul trying to manifest itself. Anyway, as work progressed on my bedroom, I started to get a little bit impatient. Most of the interior framework had been finished, and although there was still quite a bit left to do, I decided that I wanted to camp out in the area that would become my private space. This led me to haul my sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a small stack of books through the hole that would eventually become my doorway, bed down, and tried to imagine what it would be like to finally have a room of my own. As I was contemplating this, those same lights from a passing car made their way across the wall nearest to the creek bed, prompting me to silently laugh about how some things would never change. It was in that moment that I felt my blood run cold. Because although the lights were intensely familiar to me, I hadn't yet cut a hole for a window. My unfurnished bedroom was completely isolated from the world outside. For several seconds I was truly petrified. "Hello?" I finally managed to whisper. As abruptly as it had appeared, the apparition vanished. To this day I have no idea what happened. I'd be willing to bet my life on the fact that it wasn't a ghost. After all, they simply do not exist. But I don't yet have a better explanation for that dancing spectre of light on my wall.
When we were younger, about 13 or so, me and 3 friends were just goofing off after school as usual, riding our bikes and just doing what young teens do. We eventually rode past the old abandoned house that's local for us, which has basically been there since we can remember. My friend's parents, who were here since the 70s, can remember that house being abandoned since there also. Anyhow, we rode past it as usual, and decided to go a bit closer because we always were curious. As we approached it, we saw someone peeking through the curtains. As curious teenagers, we naturally go to inspect. As we got closer, the curtains kind of drew back and the figure disappeared. Stumped, we decided to approach the veranda, and that's when we heard a baby crying. The crying slowly progressed into wailing, and eventually one friend had enough and knocked to see if anyone was home. After 5 minutes of continued knocking and wailing, the door finally opened. It was a little lady who looked to be about 40 or so. My friend asked if everything was okay and if the baby was fine, and the lady simply told us to go away. My friend continued to ask if she needed help or if everything was alright, and she continued with her reply of, "Go away." This continued for about a minute, until she shut the door on us, and the wailing became louder still. At this point, everyone wanted to run, but my friend decided to knock again in fear the child was being neglected. Eventually, after a few knocks, the door just kind of opened. Not scary creaking open, but rather it was left unlocked. We, as dumb teenagers, walked in to see if everything was okay, and partially due to curiosity. As all 4 of us walked in, the crying stopped, and we stood in this abandoned house covered in dust, and everything was like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. We took a few steps forward and the crying began again. By this point, we decided we needed to find the child, so me and a friend went upstairs while the other two investigated downstairs. As we climbed the stairs, the crying got louder and louder, and we continued to search each room slowly. Eventually, we reached the last room, and it was apparently where the cot was, so we opened the door to investigate. The first thing we both noticed was nothing, except for a baby carriage in the far left corner near the window. The crying was coming from there. It was as clear as day. We made our way to it, peeked over to find nothing. But the crying was still there. From this empty carriage. My head started spinning. I don't know what to feel. I called out for my friends downstairs, and they ran upstairs and saw, or rather, didn't see, what we couldn't see. They filled us in onto what they saw downstairs, which was the woman walking into the kitchen downstairs. They followed her, and she vanished. We all knew this whole situation was messy, and we ran as quickly as we could to the front door. We got onto our bikes, looked back, to see the door being closed slowly by someone and then locked. A few moments later, the curtains were pulled back by a woman holding a child, smiling. We rode hard and fast back home and didn't turn back, and didn't sleep much for a few days. A few years after, the house got demolished, but people began seeing a woman holding a baby at the local parks and bridge. That is, when you didn't see the kid who drowned in the sewers nearby. I hated that area, and I was so glad when I moved. Sometimes I drive past it at night, and I just get the worst feeling ever. It's always too quiet, and still scares me 11 years later.
5. I was a real brat when I was like 8 until I was 10 or 11. This story takes place when I was about 10. I was known as a little kid for throwing huge meltdowns, and still kinda was during those ages, and I was living with my grandmother at this point, and I would get into these big fights with her. I would usually get sent to my room and would fall asleep soon after crying. Now let me give you some details about the house I live in, because this will be important to what I'm about to tell you next. Now, I will refer to my new house that I recently moved into as the new house, and the old house I just moved out of as the old house. Simple enough. The history behind my old house is kind of freaky, because there are actual ghosts in that one. The house was built in the 90s, and if you walked through the door near my grandma's old room, you could smell an oil that hippies would use in their hair in the 70s or 80s. Now, what would happen with, as we like to call him, the hippie ghost, is that you could only smell that weird hair product near the front of my grandmother's room. As you would walk through the door, you could sometimes smell the greasy product and be confused for a second or so. If you took a step back right to where you could smell the product before, it had just disappeared. Now there can be logic to this one and the last one, but they just seem to be off. Then there's Larry, my grandma's dead brother. She likes to say that Larry follows her everywhere and will be there to protect her. He wore this cowboy-like hat since he and my grandma grew up in El Paso, Texas. We hung his hat on the wall with some other ones and we did an experiment. If one hat falls, the rest should also fall. And here's the spooky part. Sometimes we find it had knocked off the wall, but the rest of the hats were still in place. It was only his hat that would ever fall off. With the old house one night, me and my grandmother had gotten into another fight. Nothing new, she'd sent me to my room and I laid down on my bed and began to cry. I sleep on my side and sometimes would sleep facing towards the door of my room. No one was in there, the door didn't open, so no one at all came into this room. Then I heard something that would start the chain of events I've been having to suffer through since then. Closed my eyes to hear a dark, grumbling voice say clear as day right next to my ear, "I know what you did." Now I didn't even know what I did. I still don't know what I did to this day as I'm writing this. I told my grandma the next day and she said it was probably Larry. I couldn't sleep very well and this caused me to start having sleeping troubles like now, but I've gotten better. Now most times when I would throw a tantrum, it would be because I would have to go to my room. I never felt easy in my room, especially near the closet. There was something about this room that just had an aura that wasn't right. If you stood in there today, you would understand exactly what I mean. My uncle's friend wouldn't even go into my room due to the fact of the uneasy energy that came from this room. Fast forward a couple of years to when I was super into the supernatural, and I still am very much. I had this computer in my room which was on this desk, which was right next to my room's closet. I never felt okay with it there, but it was the only place it could go since my room was so small. Strange things would occur, like an incident where I was firmly holding the handle of my glass of milk, which was firmly sat on my desk. As I held the glass, something forcefully shoved my hand to the side and made me spill it. After a month or so of things getting thrown and shoved off my desk, which wouldn't be anything new, but then objects would start getting thrown off my desk in front of my eyes. I was sitting on the computer. I had downloaded BlueStacks recently, and I was being a really unhealthy little shit, and would often eat goldfish crackers with seasoning salt on them. I was typing something and looked over at the bowl of goldfish for a second, and then bam, the next thing I know, the bowl of goldfish was thrown off my desk and across my small room. I had no idea what the hell had just happened. Occurrences like this would become normal. We had a rat problem a while back in that house. I was happy about it because no one believed me on the fact that there might be a rat in the attic, and then they found rat shit in the sugar. But after a while the rats were taken care of and the attic was sealed off, so the only thing that could ever be in that attic would be a living human being. I mentioned that for the next terrifying event. I had been hearing a knocking noise coming from my ceiling and walls, and it was certainly weird due to the fact that it sounded human, like it would be a knock that sounded almost like how a human would knock on the door wanting someone to answer. I got up one night because I had to use the restroom, and as I was getting ready to exit the bathroom I heard knocking coming from directly above me. I froze dead and didn't move or make a sound. It made 2 knocks the next time, and would continue making 2 knocks at a time until I walked over towards the bathtub. The knocks had moved to where it was above me again. I got myself up onto the edge of the bathtub, and this was certainly the most idiotic mistake I'd ever made. I knocked back once. It went silent. And then it knocked back once, not twice as it had before, once. I wanted to scream like a little girl, but instead I hopped down from the edge of the bathtub and ran as fast as I could back to my room. I didn't hear knocking coming from the walls ever again. The only things that were happening from this point were objects were still being thrown off my desk, and my grandma had announced that we were moving, so I thought that I might finally get away from what I thought was a ghost or poltergeist of sorts. I was wrong. The new house is literally brand spanking new. No one has ever died there, so no ghost except for Larry. As of a few days ago, I was on a voice call with my friends. I had recently gotten these red fairy lights and hung them around my bunk bed. Now it only has a top mattress, the bottom is space for my desk and computer. Since I moved into the house, nothing has happened. Nothing had been thrown off my desk, nothing. I thought it was finally over. I had a spoon on my desk because I recently finished a Dr. Pepper float, and as I was talking to my friends who were talking about ghosts and stuff, I looked over and I saw the spoon being dragged off my desk slowly by itself, and I sat there watching the spoon get dragged off until it hit the floor. A few minutes later, my brand new fairy lights began to flick on and off at the same time. The power could have been going out, or the fact that they were all dying or something because they were all hooked up to my computer, so if my computer was on, so were the lights. My friends thought I was joking when I started to scream and have a near panic attack. Near the last part of the summer, I was still kind of new to the house. It had been a week or so when the light and spoon thing had happened. I was currently 13 when all this was happening. Last night, I woke up and I couldn't move. I couldn't say anything. I was having my first episode of sleep paralysis. I sleep in a bunk bed, but it just has the top mattress, and this has already been established, and I was facing towards the entrance to my bed where you would climb up, and there's this little gap where the railing of the bed would suddenly stop. There I heard something climb up the ladder, because when you climb up the ladder it's really squeaky, so you know if someone's climbing up or not, and a black figure was making its way up the ladder of my bed. His head was misshapen, like the rest of his body, and there was one thing about him that will always haunt my mind. As he slowly made his way up the ladder, I saw more of him. I saw he had his mouth kind of gaping open like a smile of sorts, but it was slit open into his head, but it was large, almost cartoon-like. He continued climbing up my ladder until he began to lean closer to me, and that was when he disappeared. I fell asleep a while after. The next morning I told my grandma what I had seen and what had happened. She said I was lying and I needed to shut up. I honestly believe what I saw that night was what had been causing my lights to flicker, the spoon to be dragged off my desk, and things to be thrown across my room. This thing had appeared several times afterwards. The night before it stopped, I opened my eyes and I could move. I saw a thin white figure standing across from my bed. You could see that this thing just had to be a simple light from outside. It had to be outside light because when I sleep, the light from outside, unless it's coming from the top of my window, does not show. And if it's from the top of my window, it's a crescent shape, not a thin white figure that had to be standing as tall, maybe even taller than my bed. Then it all stopped. I'm now 14, about to be 15 in September. It's crazy to think that over the years that stuff like this happens, and as you grow older you start to question if you should have reached out to others about what was going on.
I have had a number of paranormal experiences. When I was 14, my brother left for college, and I moved into his old room. Some spooky stuff happened there. For the record, it was just me and my parents. We lived in a small town, and my friends all lived in a larger neighbouring town, so no one ever came over. Anywho, as my brother left for college, I entered high school. Most of this stuff happened during my freshman year of high school. September. After moving into the room, a skull is drawn on the dust on the window pane, near where my head rests when I sleep. It was a pretty well-drawn skull. It was on the indoor side of the window, so someone had needed to enter my room to do it. It freaks me out, and I wipe it away. Several days later, it's night. I'm studying on my bed. The lights in the room make the windows look like mirrors, as such happens at night. I look up from my textbook towards the skull window, and see a white silhouette standing behind me. Shocked, I hold my gaze for 10 seconds, turn my head around to see it directly, but it's not there. I turn to the window, and it's no longer in the reflection, and I don't sleep there that night. A few weeks pass. It's 11:09 p.m, and I'm waiting for Loveline to come on the radio. My lights are off. I'm facing the same window, and a smaller, white silhouette strides past the window right in front of me, but outside. I leave, and don't sleep there for several nights. After that occurrence, I start seeing more things drawn on the windows, mostly geometric shapes. I vaguely remember a triangle thing which gave me the creeps, but one thing I really remember, I even got a sticky note with "Draw below this" on it, and stuck it on a window. Within a few days, I found a light, perfectly drawn circle beneath the note. During all of high school, I was pretty terrified of that entire portion of the house. I would avoid it as much as possible, and I'd occasionally see dark figures out of the corner of my eye, but apparently that's a normal thing for people, so I won't put too much authority into that. Even as a child, I remember seeing colourful orbs buzzing around, though I didn't know what to think about them. But one night, during my junior year of high school, I went over to my washer/dryer, which is directly down the hall from the spooky bedroom. At that point, I'd just chosen to stop sleeping there. I look down the hall, get the normal feeling of dread, and turn my back to the hall, and bend over to empty the washing machine. I instantly lose control of my body, release my basket, stand straight up, and hear a masculine voice exhale and hiss in my ear. I regain control of my body and run the hell out of there. I also have a couple of weird family-relating things, both related to my late great-aunt. In the summer between my sophomore-junior year, my father had been having heart problems, as he had done over the past decade. My brother and I were visiting him at the hospital. My brother will bring him home tomorrow morning, and he's going to have surgery in a month. At some point, the image of my late great-aunt pops into my mind. Something seems very significant about it. Roughly 24 hours later, I'm home with my dad, and tasked with waking him up from his nap. He's blue and cold. He never wakes up. A year or two later, it's Friday night. I'm in the recliner chair where my father passed away. My mother and I are watching TV, and I smell perfume for about a minute. Is it my mother's? No, she says. The smell dies down but picks up a few minutes later. I checked the scented candles on the fireplace, but they aren't lit and didn't smell like anything regarding this perfume. Suddenly I realize it's the same perfume that my late great-aunt wore. 2 nights later, my grandfather refuses to eat, and he dies Thursday 6 days after the phantom perfume.
3. To set the scene, I grew up in a very, very rural area in the south. Think the setting of Lawless or Oh Brother Where Art Thou? That's exactly how it was. The house I grew up in had housed generations of my father's family, and was one of the family's newer houses being erected just after World War I had begun. I say house because it was a very tiny little wooden building with 1 bedroom on stilts above a small riverbank. It was drafty, there were holes in the floor, leaks in the roof, barely a shelter really. The first and less creepy apparition I saw several times. The first time I was about 10, and my sister and I were out running around in the forest near the house one summer day. Our dad was out in the forest nearby, cutting wood and building a shed of some type. We were running in circles by an old family cabin which had a mirror attached to the outside of the back porch, facing the thick trees. As we were running, I remember glancing in the mirror and seeing my face every single time I passed, except one time I ran past and saw a man standing in the forest. I thought it was my dad for a few reasons. My dad was tall, very dark-skinned, and had really large arms, and he always cut the arms out of his shirts because they were uncomfortable. He also has this special stoop, which I guess he'd prefer to call a cool lean. The guy in the woods was turned facing me, and had a shirt with the sleeves cut out, and I remember seeing big bulky arms, dark skin, lots of hair just like my dad, but my dad is covered in tattoos and this man had none. I skidded to a stop, looking in the mirror and in the woods, nothing. I asked my sister if she'd seen the man in the woods and she said no. So I ran to my dad, who predictably told me I was imagining things. But his eyes did scan the forest, and I got this eerie feeling that he'd seen something, whether this day or some other. Years went by and nothing else, and then one day I was sitting on the living room floor watching cartoons. My dad walked in the front door, behind me, and I only saw him out of my peripheral as I was facing the TV. He came into the living room and sat down on his recliner, and I remember hearing his boots thudding off the floor as he took them off, which he always did. He has a particular way of sitting, arms out, head back, feet crossed at the ankles, and he now sat like that. I didn't turn around, figuring he was going to eventually take the remote and change the channel, but he just sat in the chair, he said nothing, which was pretty typical for him, but I could feel him staring at me while I watched TV. That's very abnormal, but I tried to ignore it. After maybe 10 more minutes of being lost in the Sailor Moon episode, I turned around out of curiosity and the chair was completely empty. I was floored. The door had opened, closed, I saw a figure that was just like my dad walk into the living room and take off his shoes. I had even seen out the corner of my eye him relax in the chair the way he always did, with his arms out and his head back. I got up and went outside and he wasn't even home, his truck was gone. That was when I was about 12. At age 14, I was sitting in the kitchen sketching something and listening to music with headphones. My dad has this habit of crossing the kitchen to the front door, standing there and looking at you expectantly, and when you take off the headphones he always has some chore or something he wants you to do. So while I was nose deep in my art, he crossed the kitchen and stood there. He was about 10 feet away, but I remember his stoop, his sleeveless shirt and his big arms. Again, the same figure. He was looking at me expectantly and had a smile on his face, which was so unlike my dad. He never smiled, ever. So I thought, oh, he must like what I'm sketching, as he seemed to look down at the art. He never gestured or started talking, so I continued drawing. He stood there maybe 2 minutes in total, and then he exited the house without saying anything, going through the open front door. I thought the whole experience was weird, and since my dad is kinda crazy, I thought something was wrong. I got up and took off the headphones, and was startled. My dad was talking in the living room. I ran into the living room, and yep, he was on the phone, talking to a family friend. So who had crossed the kitchen and exited the open door? I had no explanation for any of this and always chalked it up to me being so familiar with seeing my dad that I was making up seeing him in my head. But then a few years later I went to live with my aunt, my dad's sister, and she pulled out some photographs of my grandpa. He'd died before I was born, and I'd never seen any photos of him. I was completely floored. Every photo, sleeveless shirt, familiar stoop, dark skin, large arms, no tattoos. It was so spooky. I immediately recognized his smile as the one I'd seen my dad give me when I was sketching. Even more telling was the one photo where he was sitting in a recliner, shoes off, arms out, head back. I think that I got to see my grandfather, or rather, he got to see me, despite our never having shared time on Earth. I never felt scared or worried or anything when he'd appeared. I just felt that a family member was around. And he never did anything except stop by a few times to check in on me, never tried to communicate or did anything weird or ghostly, just looked at me and smiled.
When I was 17, I saw the scariest thing in my life. My parents went out of town for the weekend, which wasn't a big deal for me, as they did that all the time. Well, I was home alone one Friday night at around 9 or 10 o'clock, and was starting to get a mild headache. My dad always kept the ibuprofen on his nightstand next to his bed, so I went to get some. When I turned on the light to the bedroom, I saw a black figure about 3 feet in height and 4 feet in front of me. I know this sounds cheesy, but it had horns on its head kind of like Batman, and long skinny feet. It moved so fluidly, like a mixture of smoke and water. I watched it run from in front of me around the bed and into the wall. The wall was the one wall I shared with my bedroom. I had other experiences in that apartment, but that one was by far the creepiest.
4. I've always been a believer in ghosts. I've had several experiences throughout my 24 years here on Earth that only furthered my belief. None of these experiences I'm about to tell are particularly scary, but 100% true nonetheless. The first experience I remember is a pretty hazy one, so much so in fact that I'm no longer sure if it actually happened or if it was just a dream. I maintain that it actually happened. It is also the only experience that I have never spoken of before now. When I was about 4 or 5, I was living with my parents and siblings in an old house in Maine. My sister, 2 years my junior, and I shared a room on the second floor at the back of the house. There was a small door in the corner of the room which led to a small balcony-like area in the barn that was attached to the house. The door was small, much like one you would see leading to a crawl space, and seemed the perfect size for my sister and I. My bed was closest to this door, something I was never comfortable with but didn't have an explanation for my discomfort at the time. I always felt most comfortable if I was lying in bed facing the door, afraid that something or someone would come through it without me seeing it. One night I awoke and felt compelled to get out of bed and get into the barn through the little door. To this day I don't know why I actually did it. I climbed out of bed and went to the door, opening it slowly as to not make a lot of noise and wake my sister. The barn was eerily quiet, and I could see a strange white glow coming from the ground floor in the center of the barn. I crept slowly towards the edge of the balcony until I could see what was causing the light, and looking back now was surprisingly unfazed by what I saw. Standing in the middle of the barn was a figure. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, that seemed to be completely made of light. They were almost see-through, yet solid at the same time. The figure was just standing with their arms raised above their head facing the ceiling of the barn with their eyes closed. Almost as soon as I saw the figure, I felt compelled to go back to bed. Without reacting to what I was seeing at all, I slowly backed into my bedroom. As soon as I shut the door, the fear hit me, and I made a running leap into my bed and hid myself under the blankets. It took me a bit to fall back to sleep, but eventually I did, making sure I didn't turn my back to the door. I never told my parents about what I saw, or anyone else for that matter. It was the only time it happened, and I never felt scared of the barn. My fear of having my back to the door as I slept never went away. However, I also never had any other experience of that nature in the house. Most of my other experiences occurred later in life, in a different house. My family moved a bit during my childhood, the separation of my parents when I was 6 being a major cause, but none of the houses either parent moved to seemed to have any paranormal activity. My mum remarried when I was 8, and we moved into a house in Vermont where we would remain for the rest of my school career and where I eventually moved back to after my mum and stepdad moved back to Maine. It was in that house where I would have several more experiences. Here they are, not necessarily in chronological order. First, I must say that I maintain that the Vermont house had 2 very separate energies haunting it. In the living room, I could feel a calm, somewhat somber energy that was definitely female. The house is known as the Wynne House, built in 1825, and I believe the female ghost is that of Mary Wynne, whom the house is named for. The other energy was somewhat darker, not bad, but not very good either, and it was definitely male. Maybe Mary Wynne's husband, although I'm not sure if she ever married. The second ghost made a habit of lurking in the kitchen dining room. My parents remodeled the 2 rooms when I was in senior high school. The second ghost made a habit of lurking in the kitchen dining room. My parents remodeled the 2 rooms when I was a senior in high school, swapping their locations, and also seemed to retreat into the indoor porch-turned-laundry room off the master bedroom, which was next to the kitchen dining room. My sister and I initially shared one of the 2 bedrooms upstairs, my brother, 6 years my senior, in the other. I never experienced anything in the room I shared with my sister. When my brother moved away to college, I moved into his room, needing more privacy as I was getting older and coming into puberty and couldn't stand my sister at times. It was in this room where I started experiencing things I could not explain. It was usually small things, like objects being in different places than where I'd initially put them. Sometimes things disappeared for weeks at a time, only to appear again exactly where I had left them. It unnerved me, but I never felt threatened by any of it, so I just shook it off. As I grew older, the more I opened myself to it, the more I experienced. I am still unsure if the energy in my bedroom was that of one of the 2 ghosts downstairs, or of a separate entity entirely. When I went away to college, I was convinced that the energy from my room followed me to Michigan, where I went to school. I could always feel a familiar presence, but never experience what I had at home. I always played it off and spoke of it as my imaginary friend, whom I had dubbed Francis. It seemed fitting for some reason. When I was in high school, I got a job working at a local ice cream parlor. Working the second shift, I usually didn't get home until around 11 or 12 at night. One night I came home and my parents had gone to bed and my sister was upstairs asleep as well. When you walk in through the front door, immediately in front of you is a door that leads to the stairway going to the second floor. To the left is the kitchen dining room, and to the right is the living room. I shut the front door quietly behind me, trying to avoid waking up our dog who was sleeping in my parents' bedroom. I shut the porch light off that my mother had left on for me and plummeted myself into darkness. As I reached for the door to go upstairs, I heard a loud whisper from the living room. I was extremely creeped out, 1, because no one in the house was awake or in the living room, and 2, because of what the whisper said. My name. It was a quick, "Lee." Without responding to it at all, I ran up to my room and got ready for bed as fast as I could. Another experience I had was when I was sitting in the living room watching a baseball game one summer night. My parents had gone to bed and my sister was upstairs in her room reading. All of a sudden, the whole room started smelling of strong flowery perfume, as if someone had doused themselves in it and sat down right next to me on the couch. The smell lingered for about 10 minutes and then dissipated as quickly as it had come about. A quick side note, the TV did not have a remote and had to be shut off manually. We had 2 remotes, one for the cable box and one for the stereo, both of which lay on the coffee table a few feet in front of me. When the game was over, I stood up and reached for the remotes to shut things down. When my hand was inches from the stereo remote, all 3 devices, TV, cable box and stereo, shut off simultaneously. This undoubtedly freaked me out, so I quickly turned around, turned off the lamp that was behind me and went upstairs. The next day I told my mum about what had happened, and she told me that she had not experienced the electronics being shut off, but she had smelled the perfume one time, and it was exactly as I described it to her. She also had a few isolated experiences in that house, and that she and I were the only ones to ever experience anything. I always felt like there was someone in the living room with me, most when I was alone, but I could feel the energy even if other people were there with me. Sometimes I could feel someone pacing back and forth in the far end of the living room. Other times it was as if someone was sitting on whatever couch I wasn't. We had 2. In the instances when I felt them on the opposite couch, it was a very relaxed feeling, like they were just joining me in my television watching. The weirdest experience I had was during my junior year of high school. I was up in my room watching Law & Order on my tiny 13-inch television. I was seated on the foot of my bed, my window was open, my lamp on my nightstand next to the bed was on, and the TV remote was next to the lamp. My sister was already asleep in her room across the hall. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, my entire atmosphere had changed. I was tucked into my bed, lying on my back, which is something I never do because I can't sleep in that position. My window was closed, the light and the TV were shut off, and the remote, as I found later, was across the room under my desk, and it was 4 hours later. It scared the shit out of me. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to wake my parents up over something I didn't fully understand, so I just forced myself to fall asleep. To this day I can't explain what happened. I asked my mum if maybe she had come upstairs and did anything, maybe I had fallen asleep and didn't realise it, but she said she had not been upstairs for a few days, let alone that night. I don't really think it had anything to do with ghosts, and aliens were my next best guess, but I have no idea. A couple of years ago, I had been moved out for a few years, and my now ex-girlfriend and I were staying at my parents' house dog-sitting while my parents were visiting my grandmother up in Maine. We arrived at the house, dropped our bags off inside, and brought the dog out to the car because we were going into town to take him for a walk through the park and a cemetery, one of our favourite pastimes. As we were getting him into the car, we both turned toward the living room window where we saw a face looking back at us. It was an old woman who stood just in front of the window, leaning forward as she watched us. When she saw us look at her, she backed away from the window and disappeared. My ex and I just looked at each other, not needing to say anything to know that we had both seen exactly the same thing. A couple of years later, this past year in fact, my parents had moved back to Maine and my current boyfriend and I rented the house from them. When I moved back into the house, the feeling of their presence seemed to increase. The energy in the dining room felt much stronger, but only when my boyfriend wasn't home. He has a strong energy himself and I feel like it repelled the ghost. When I sat on the couch in the living room that was against the front wall, I could see into the dining room, and usually felt someone standing in the dining room looking into the living room. I usually made it a habit not to sit on that couch because the constant feeling of being watched unnerved me slightly. I was also uncomfortable walking through the dining room when the lights were off, always unnecessarily rushing through it if I was home alone. Despite all the experiences I had in that house, I never felt threatened by the energies inside it. I always made a point of making my feelings about their presence known to them, letting them know that I didn't mind sharing the house with them as long as they didn't frighten me. The year I lived there with my boyfriend was fairly uneventful, but I could feel them constantly. One day a friend of ours was over, and he and I started talking about ghosts. Before I told him anything about my experiences, I took him on a walk through the house to see what he could pick up. He hit every nail on the head, from the sexes of the spirits to the locations of high activity. I told him of my experiences and he didn't seem surprised in the least. The creepiest part about our conversation was when he stopped mid-sentence, looked directly at me and said, "They're here for you." He then said that what he meant was that they felt protective of me. I had grown up in that house and they felt a connection to me that drew them toward me. I was always the one who experienced the most, and it was most likely because they could sense that I was the most open to the idea of them. We moved out of that house a couple of months ago, and the house we are in now has not presented me with any ghostly energies.
5 years ago, I was a little Mormon missionary serving in Nebraska. My companion and I were at church one Sunday, and it was a typical Sunday. Said hi to all the families we saw in the halls and foyer, and there was one 13-year-old girl in the ward named Mary. She was one who always had some sort of snack made up for each of us that week that she gave to us at church. Normally she was always so nice and polite and always took any opportunity to greet us. She was walking towards us in the hall that morning, and I noticed that she was super pale and had this wide-eyed look and was just staring straight ahead without blinking. As we were walking by, I said, "Hey Mary, how are you today?" I got no response. She didn't even look at us. Red flags went up because she would never do something like that. After church, I told my companion that I wanted to talk to Mary's mum to see if everything was okay. When I found her, I could tell that she was uneasy and just looked worried. I asked her, and she immediately began crying. We told her that we would stop by their house immediately after church and see if we could talk with Mary and her family. When we got to her house, I had a kind of eerie feeling. I asked my companion if he felt the same, and he agreed. Mary's mum answered the door and sat us down in the living room. We asked her if everything was all right with Mary. She was at a loss for words for a moment, and just told us that she didn't know. She said the past week Mary acted mad and disgusted towards her family. Mind you, this is one of the closest families I've ever seen. She said that Mary randomly attacked her older brother earlier in the week. Nothing too serious, she just started punching and kicking him. Her mum couldn't understand the sudden change in her attitude. We asked if we could talk to Mary to see if we could get anything out of her. From the couch we were sitting on, we could see down the hallway where the bedrooms were. As soon as I saw Mary come out of her room, and as she started walking down the hallway, I immediately had a feeling that I can't quite fully describe. It was the worst feeling I've ever felt. I can honestly say that the one word to describe it would be evil. Mary had the same wide-eyed look that she had at church. She sat down in a chair in front of us and just stared at the wall in front of her. I asked her if everything was all right. She didn't answer. I asked her if she was angry at her family and why she had attacked her brothers. She finally stopped staring at the wall and looked at me. That awful feeling I had got worse when she looked at me, and she said that she was told to hurt him. I asked her, who told her? And she said the voices told her to hurt her family and leave. I asked her if she knew where the voices were coming from, and she didn't answer. I asked her mother if I could give her a blessing. She immediately said yes. When we gave her a blessing, she didn't resist at all. She just sat there. After we gave her the blessing, the mood immediately changed. She was no longer wide-eyed, with a glazed look about her. Her colour was starting to come back, and she was breathing heavily. That awful evil feeling that I had gone away. As male missionaries, we aren't allowed to hug females, but after a few minutes had gone by, Mary gave me a very big hug, and I wasn't about to fight it or deny it. When we left their house and got into our car, my companion and I just both sat there for a few minutes, thinking about what the hell had just happened. He finally broke the silence and said, "I don't like the feeling I had back there." I told him I had the same feeling. We checked up on her next Sunday at church, and she was back to being the happy-go-lucky Mary that everyone knew. We asked her mum how everything was back at home, and she said it was like nothing had happened. A few weeks later, I asked Mary if she remembered anything about it. She said that she could only vaguely remember attacking her brother and not knowing why, and that after that we gave her a blessing. It was like she'd woken up from a dream. Being a religious person, you hear stories about demons and possessions in the scriptures and in stories, and there are countless movies about them. But I never gave it a real second thought. I don't know exactly what happened with Mary, whether she was actually possessed or it be something else. She didn't crawl up a wall. Her head didn't spin around, and she didn't speak in a different language. All I have to go on is this feeling. The feeling I had when she walked into the room, with her glazed look, pale skin, and her answer about the voices. I will never forget that story, or the feeling I had. I hope to never feel it again, and it scared the hell out of me. Sorry to get all religious.
2. Just so we're on the same page, I live in the UK, so for people that don't, when I say Nana, then it's grandmother. For the past 7 years, I have lived with my nana and my little brother. My nana was very funny but very strict. Couldn't be too loud, must always say please and thank you, had a strict bedtime, and if I did anything wrong I would be banned from my electronic items such as phone, laptop or computer. Anyway, she was an amazing nana, but I don't want to give a reason and go into detail with it, but she has passed away. My auntie has always had the sixth sense, and she said at Christmas time, the last Christmas time that she was with us, "Why does it feel like it's the last Christmas we're having with my mum?" Meaning my nana. She had what we thought was sciatica and was struggling to move and walk, and had passed away in our living room. A few months after, we bought a dog called Lily, who was a few years old now and called Lily because it was my nana's favourite flower. A few weeks after buying her, she started barking at the TV, and when we walked past the living room she barked at it but no one was in there. I stayed in my bedroom with her most of the night to comfort her, and to be honest, comfort myself as well, as it was a bit freaky. I worked myself up into believing all sorts. A few months later, my brother was at school, and when it was time for him to come back on his school bus, my auntie went out to go and get him. The new ashtray that my nana bought before she passed away, that she planned to use but didn't have the chance to, had smashed. There was no one in the house that was able to smash it or to knock it over, except Lily, but she's a small dog and isn't strong enough or big enough to move it, and is a very well-behaved dog and knows not to jump up on furniture without permission, let alone a table. A month later, my auntie, who I'm living with now, had gone away for the weekend and I had to stay with my cousins at my other auntie's house. I went home just to clean my room and to fetch a wire I needed so I could play some music on my auntie's speakers, and thought, okay, I will tidy my room while listening to some music. As I said before, my nana did not like loud noises or music. I got really into the song and turned my speakers up a bit more. They are quite heavy so they do not vibrate when playing music, even when they are on full volume. I went downstairs with some glasses and cups to clean them, and I hear a huge thud. Thinking nothing of it, I go back upstairs to see my speaker on the floor dented. It had fallen off my windowsill, which was deep enough for my speaker to balance on it, and the speaker was pushed back quite far so it wouldn't have fallen from the wind, and the windows were closed at the time because I remember locking them. A month later, I came downstairs to the light being on during the daytime, so I asked my auntie why she turned on the light, and she replied saying that she didn't, and that she had no reason to turn it on at all. The week after, I was looking up a subreddit to post this story, and as I typed the word paranormal, a little laminated card I have which says, "In memory of a loving nana," with a poem dedicated to her that was held onto the wall with blue tack and an elastic band, had fallen. The elastic band had snapped, and the card had fell to the floor. Since my nana passed away, I bought some large speakers as she never let me play music before, but since living with my auntie in that house, she let me go get some so I can play music a few times a week. For a few weeks at 3 in the morning, when I'm asleep and everyone else as well, they will turn on and tune the radio to static at full volume, waking me up in shock. I never noticed if anything played through the static as I was too tired to listen, and plus it was too loud even on low volume, so eventually I had to unplug them from the socket at night. This is all happening in the same house my nana lived in. Please help me, is this paranormal or just extremely coincidental? We all hope you enjoyed the video. Top 5 Darkest here, inviting you all to come on over and check out our channel. If you're interested in the paranormal, unexplained, and all things creepy, follow the link on screen now and in the description. A big thank you to Mortis Media for allowing us to collaborate on this video, and we'd hope to do so again in the future if you'd all like to hear from us again.